Welcome to the world of Pettyrevenge, a subreddit where revenge can be sweet, and sometimes it's the little things that pack the biggest punch. This is the story of how I finally got back at a smug jerk who had been making my life hell. At the time, I was working as a waitress at a small-town diner, doing everything I could just to stay afloat. Money was tight. My job wasn't exactly glamorous, and life was full of daily struggles. But the real source of my frustration was a particular family who came in every Sunday, a family led by a man I can only describe as the embodiment of smugness. Little did I know, I was about to find a way to get back at him in the most satisfying and unexpected way. It wasn't just about a bad tip, it was about the way this guy treated people. How he acted like he was above it all. He had no idea what was coming. This is the story of how I got my revenge, one small, petty act at a time. Life had been tough, especially after I lost my job. A once promising position had fallen through, and without a steady income, I was forced to scrape by. I lived in my car for weeks, often having to choose between paying for a meal or getting gas to make it to my next shift. The feeling of exhaustion was constant, both mentally and physically, but I refused to give up. I applied for job after job, but nothing stuck. So, when I finally landed a waitressing gig at a local diner, I took it, desperate for any income. The job paid minimum wage, which barely covered the basics, but I wasn't one to complain. I picked up extra shifts, even took on side gigs like cleaning houses at night. Some days I barely got any sleep. I'd wake up tired, work hard all day, and then go to sleep feeling drained, only to do it all over again. The emotional toll was heavy. I was lonely, isolated, and often hungry. I remember days when I'd serve food to customers, wishing I could just have one bite of what they were eating. There was little joy left in my life, and that's when I started to notice a regular group that would come into the diner on Sundays, the Smug family. They weren't just any customers. They were the kind of people who seemed to think they were above everyone else. The father, in particular, stood out. He had a certain air about him, like he was doing everyone a favor by showing up. He always wore a suit, like he was too good for this small-town diner, and yet he never seemed to leave a proper tip. He'd smile condescendingly at me, acting like he was some kind of moral authority. The worst part was, he seemed oblivious to the impact of his actions on others. He never left more than $1, if anything. It was clear that this family believed their presence was enough to warrant special treatment, even though they were doing nothing to earn it. I put up with it for a while, gritting my teeth through their visits. But I was getting fed up. I had enough of being looked down on, of getting the bare minimum while these people acted like they owned the world. The first time I really noticed them, they came in on a quiet Sunday afternoon. I was exhausted after a long week, barely holding it together, and their arrival felt like a punch to the gut. They were loud, laughing and chatting like they owned the place, with the father leading the charge. He was wearing his usual suit, making small talk with his family as though I wasn't standing there waiting to take their order. I took their order, keeping a polite smile on my face despite the growing frustration inside me. I had learned to mask my exhaustion behind a friendly demeanor, but the longer they stayed, the harder it was to keep my composure. The father seemed particularly smug, nodding at me as though I should be grateful for the privilege of serving him. I couldn't stand it, but I forced myself to remain professional. When their meal was over, I went back to check on them. As I handed them the check, I noticed that the father reached into his wallet, pulled out a bill, and slid it toward me. At first, I was hopeful. Maybe he was finally going to leave a decent tip. But as I picked it up, my heart sank. It wasn't real money. The bill was a fake $100 note with the name and address of his church printed on the back. I was speechless. Here I was, working my butt off, barely making enough to get by, and this smug jerk was leaving me a joke instead of a tip. It wasn't just the lack of generosity, it was the insult. He didn't even bother to leave a real tip. He was treating me like I was beneath him, like I was unworthy of real respect. I held the fake bill in my hand, trying to keep my emotions in check. I smiled tightly and walked away, but inside I was seething. How dare he? How dare he think this was acceptable? This wasn't just a case of bad manners, it was a blatant disregard for my hard work and dignity. I was determined to get my revenge. He had no idea what was coming next. Despite my attempts to move past the humiliation of the fake tip, the Smug family continued to frequent the diner every Sunday. Each time they walked in, I couldn't help but feel a little more resentment bubbling inside me. The father was a regular, always acting as if he were doing me a favor just by showing up. I still couldn't get over the fake bill, and every time he came in, my frustration grew. I decided I would confront him about the fake tip, but as soon as I tried to bring it up, he brushed me off with a dismissive wave. He never took responsibility for his actions, always playing the moral high ground. He would talk about riches in God and how material wealth wasn't important, acting as though he was some kind of saint. But all the while, he'd leave a miserly dollar or nothing at all as a tip, completely ignoring the hypocrisy of his words. It was infuriating. He talked about giving generously, but he couldn't even extend that courtesy to the people who worked for him. It was clear he was self-righteous, seeing himself as better than everyone else. I began to plan my quiet revenge. I wasn't going to let him get away with treating me and others this way. Something needed to be done, and I knew I would find a way. Then, one fateful Sunday, disaster struck. A hurricane hit the area, and the diner got flooded. The owner announced that the diner would be closed for several weeks for repairs, leaving me without work for the time being. It wasn't ideal, but I was determined to make the best of it. With no work to go to on Sundays, I found myself with free time I didn't know what to do with. It was during this time that I thought about the church the Smug father had mentioned so many times. He often spoke about his devotion to his faith, claiming to find true wealth in spiritual matters rather than in money. Out of curiosity and sheer frustration, I decided to check out the church. When I entered, I immediately realized it was much smaller than I had imagined. It wasn't the grand, high-end place I expected. It was humble and intimate. But then, to my surprise, I saw him. The Smug father was there, not as a diner customer, but as the pastor. He was standing at the front, preaching to a small congregation. It clicked in my mind. This was the perfect opportunity to get my revenge. The very man who had humiliated me for so long was now in a position of power in this small church. I couldn't let this chance slip away. As I sat in the back pew, listening to his sermon about humility and spiritual wealth, my mind was already working. This was going to be a delicate game of patience. He had no idea what I was about to do, and I couldn't help but smile quietly to myself. This was the perfect setup. The wheels of my revenge were starting to turn. It didn't take long for me to come up with my plan. I wasn't going to confront him directly. That wouldn't be as satisfying, nor would it hit him in the way I wanted. Instead, I devised a subtle, almost poetic revenge. I bought a lottery ticket. The next Sunday, I walked into the church with the ticket hidden in my hand. The Smug father, now in his role as the pastor, was busy speaking with a few congregants, his usual air of superiority evident even here. I waited until the service began and then quietly made my way to the offering basket at the front. As the pastor led the congregation in prayer, I dropped the lottery ticket into the basket. As I returned to my seat, I couldn't help but feel a little thrill. I had done it. The Smug pastor had no idea what was coming. A few moments later, I heard him chuckling softly as he retrieved the offering basket, noticing the ticket. "Ah, someone's hoping for a little divine intervention," he said, teasingly loud enough for the few people around him to hear. I stayed silent, not revealing my true intentions. On the outside, I appeared calm, but inside, I was grinning. The thought of him holding that ticket, thinking it was just a joke or an innocent offering, filled me with satisfaction. Little did he know, I had no intention of winning that lottery. The real reward for me was in seeing him squirm when he realized what was happening. What would he do when the ticket won? Would he keep it, or would he try to deny its significance? I couldn't wait to see his face when the news broke, and I knew that, in the end, he'd realize the price of his arrogance. He had unknowingly walked straight into my trap. The day I found out the diner was closing for good was bittersweet. It was a small-town establishment that had given me a job when I needed it most, but it was time to move on. I had secured a new position in Cincinnati, a fresh start in a new city. As excited as I was about the future, there was one last thing I had to do. I knew that Sunday would be my final visit to the church. The pastor had no idea who I really was, nor would he ever learn that he had been a part of a plan I'd carried out over the past few months. I wasn't sure what to expect when I walked into the small, quiet church that morning, but I knew I'd confront him before I left. The pastor greeted me as he always did, but there was a hint of something different in his eyes. After the service, when most of the congregation had filed out, he quietly approached me. "You know," he said, his voice lower than usual, "it was hurtful to make a joke about the offering. I thought that ticket might actually help fix the roof. The church is in desperate need." I stared at him for a moment, then calmly responded, "You know, a year ago, I was struggling. I worked at the diner. I was doing everything I could just to get by. You gave me a fake $100 bill as a tip. It hurt. I was hungry. I was exhausted. But you, with your talk about riches and God and moral superiority, didn't care." His face fell as he realized what I was referring to. "I wasn't joking when I gave you that ticket," I added. "I just wanted you to feel what it was like to give, really give." The pastor didn't say anything more. He looked taken aback, and for the first time his smug demeanor seemed to falter. Without another word, I turned and walked out of the church, feeling a sense of calm and quiet victory wash over me. I was done. The chapter was closed, and I had gotten the closure I needed. As I drove away, heading toward my new life in Cincinnati, I couldn't help but smile. The emotional release of everything that had been building up inside me felt like a weight lifting off my shoulders. I had carried that anger, that resentment for so long, and now it was finally over. The past was behind me, and I had taken a small but meaningful stand against the injustice I'd endured. In a way, the pastor had no idea how much his actions had affected me. His lack of empathy when he handed me that fake bill during my hardest times had cut deep. Now, he would remember that feeling, if only for a moment, and I would be able to move on, free from the need to prove myself to someone who never deserved my respect in the first place. As I turned the corner onto the highway, I took a deep breath and realized that my petty little revenge had been worth every second. I was finally free, not just from my old life in the diner, but from the burden of allowing someone like him to have any power over me. In the weeks that followed my departure, word about the fake lottery ticket spread through the small church community. Some of the more sympathetic members reached out to me, expressing how sorry they were for what had happened, and a few even hinted that they had always been uncomfortable with the pastor's behavior but didn't know how to confront him. It seemed like the pastor's reputation was starting to crack. As more people began to talk, questions arose about the pastor's integrity. His constant preaching about giving, while never offering much in return, was starting to seem hypocritical. Slowly, people began to wonder if the church was being run with the right intentions. Several congregants even pulled back from attending services as regularly as they once had. The community, once so devoted to the pastor, started to reconsider their views. They began questioning the actions of the man they had looked up to, especially in light of his treatment of others. Word got out about his stinginess, and people began to see the cracks in his moral facade. My small act had indirectly caused a ripple effect, making people reflect on how they treated others, especially those who were struggling. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about a community coming to terms with the truth. Reflecting on the whole situation, I realized that small acts of revenge can create ripples that last far longer than we expect. What started as a quiet, petty act of retribution had grown into something far more significant than I had imagined. It wasn't just about me getting back at the pastor. It was about giving him a taste of what it felt like to be on the receiving end of selfishness and hypocrisy. I left behind that chapter of my life with a sense of accomplishment. I stood up for myself in a way that was satisfying, even if it was small and subtle. The feeling of finally getting closure on something that had weighed me down for so long was freeing. As I drove toward my new life, I couldn't help but think that smugness and unfairness always come back around. People who think they can take advantage of others will eventually find themselves confronted with their own actions. In the end, sometimes the best way to stand up to unjust behavior is with a little bit of petty, but incredibly satisfying, revenge. That wraps up today's episode of r/Payback. If you enjoyed the ride, don't forget to subscribe for more epic stories.